about the plagues in Egypt, that things would come and destroy and attack people before he was allowed to. So Moses, I put a date around 1400 before Christ. There's some controversy whether it's 1300, 1500, 1400. The dates are not very clear because even in the Old Testament, the Pharaoh from which he is finally allows him to leave is never identified by name. So we don't know for sure who is the Pharaoh at the time of Moses. But maybe could have been Amenhotep the Fourth, also known as Akhenaten, and we do know better the date. He's about 1300 before Christ. He was a kind of a famous by relation to us. We know him as the father of Tutankhamen. He was also married to Nefertiti. We probably know these names more than we know his name. But what was important about him is that, as some of you may know, the Egyptian religion was very detailed in the description of the life after death. It talked about you dying, going into a boat, having to pay a little toll to get into the spiritual world. However, back to this notion of the mysticism that existed and started to grow at this time, only the priests were allowed to have an insight and a communication into that afterlife communication. And obviously that gathered a lot of power for them. And they often had as much power as the Pharaoh himself. Well, Akhenaten actually went against that tradition of that established power by having visions that, in contrast to what existed at the time when they had many different gods which they prayed. Every kind of priest group created their own god, and they created their own kind of rituals around that god. He was promoting monotheism, one god. Right? And he chose, and his vision was around the god Ra, also called Akhenaten. That's why he actually changed his name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. The Aten at the name, at the end, represents the god that he was following. So he tried to transform Egyptian society by introducing monotheism. While he was alive, he was able to impose this, but after his death, things went back to normal. Right? So this is also very typical that we find throughout the history of mediums, that some of them are just way ahead of their time. But nevertheless, their message, their attempt, their vision around the transformation of our social relationships somehow continue. Now, from that point on, for a long time, we see that there are many recorded instances of the continued communications between certain human beings and the spiritual world. And these people were deemed to be very special. They became mystic and powerful, just like what's happening in Egypt. The people who had the ability to communicate with the dead were given a very special religious status within their society. And maybe the best representative of this was the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi is a city in the Greek Empire, and for many centuries it was the site of religious temples. And among them, the one that was most well known was Pythia. Now, Pythia was not a single person, because they were women that were deemed to have the ability to speak with the gods. And they changed. As one Pythia was dying, another one came on. They were still all called Pythia, right? She became, whoever was at the time, very influential. Emperors, generals, wealthy people would come looking for premonitions, looking for direction and guidance of how to do their lives, where to go to war, when not to go to war, where to build a city and not build a city. And established a very strong base of religious influence over the life of people. This was happening over many, many centuries. And, you know, we might ask, is this kind of a unique situation that happened in Greece? Early civilizations, tribes were coming together, creating cities. Our whole social relationship was changing. And of course, it would be silly to think that it was only happening in Greece. As we also know from our Spiritist teaching, is that when spirits are transforming or help the progression of a world, they will often send similar messages or similar mechanisms in many different places at the same time. And a simple view of back then of other cultures, other societies, which had similar notions of priests and soothsayers, were recorded everywhere from China with the I Ching. Those who don't know, the I Ching is a book. Actually, it is a guide for mediunic communication, for foreseeing future. Tibet, right? Tibet has also a very long and established tradition of oracles. In fact, the Dalai Lama must consult the oracle once a year as a tradition. Hinduism. So we're going all over the map, not only geographically, but also from a religious perspective, seeing that all of them were experiencing individuals or somehow were able to view and see things that others could not. Now, we know that among them could be quite a few of charlatans and people who were not experiencing. But I guess the point is, as we see this happening in the Norse methodology, where one king brings the other, a severed head of another god, and uses that head as the oracle now. It's kind of gruesome, but still probably effective. The Celts, the Druids, had essentially established themselves as the guides of between the material and the invisible world. The Mayas, also lots of records of the influence and the power of the priests. We find it even in Hawaii. We have records of established oracles at that region, at that place. So we see that this is not something that happened. It was not a specific cultural thing. It was not something that was unique to a specific religion. In fact, it was happening. Now, the simultaneously here is spanning maybe 6 to 10 centuries. Early development of our civilization. Everywhere in the world, we're growing. So now we start to understand why Spiritism talk about the evolution of the world, not just of individual societies. Things are happening, apparently disconnected, apparently at different paces, but if we take a bigger picture, we see that they're happening with a pattern, with a plan, with a consistency that allows mistakes, allows different speeds and abilities of different societies to incorporate these ideas faster or slower. So this takes us now to a great watershed, a great transformation. Now the second revelation comes with Jesus. And certainly the Bible and Jesus is a fantastic source of dozens of mediunic stories. And because of that, because it merits a presentation on its own, I'm not going to talk about Jesus today. I'm going to focus more on the mortals, in the incarnated humans, right? But I do encourage anybody who is interested in this topic to look at a number of presentations that talk about mediunic characteristics of the Bible. But Jesus started a trend now. right? He has introduced new ideas. He has introduced a new gospel to the world. And then he leaves us. And now it's up to us to take that. But we're not alone. We're not going to be on that track alone. Our guides, our spirits will help us with that. With more stories, more individuals coming and continuing the work that had been started then. One of them was a fellow by Apollonius, or Tiana. He comes in right after Jesus, around the same time. They were very likely, and again, because we don't know exactly the records, they were alive together at the same time. But Apollonius was born a little bit later. And he was a Greek philosopher. The Greek Empire was expanding very much, so he was actually born in what is today Turkey. And he was also a preacher. Some people find a lot of similarities with what he was doing with what Jesus did, not obviously in the quality or the extent of the content, but he also preaching all kinds of ideas around spiritual life, about our purpose here. And he would wander the Turkish, the Greek Empire, but the Turkish region, preaching these ideas. And he had followers similar to Jesus. He had his own set of apostles. And a couple of records exist of some of the stories and some of the ideas that Apollonius was preaching. And from it, we know that he had several mediumnic capabilities. The first one was clairvoyance, right? He was able, one story tells, to predict the death of the emperor in Rome, right? A tyrant which he despised because of the oppression that the Romans had on the religious thinking. And, in those days, no internet, phones, no TV. So he basically told his followers that the emperor had died, right? Ephesus. Well, in Ephesus, right? He was talking about, who was I forgot the name of the emperor. Nevertheless, several days later comes the news that the emperor had been killed. The very same day that he had told his followers that it had happened. And there's also stories that he would come back and appear to at least one of his followers. And interesting enough, the one that had the greatest difficulty in accepting the notion of afterlife. So he shows up to him in a vision. But Apollonius was not the only one. Records from the early days of Christianism are very, very difficult to come by. But one story that most people believe and have a greater certainty is about Vibia Perpetua. Vibia is probably one of the first Christian martyrs, certainly the first female Christian, has heard voices to tell her to believe in the words of Christ, to promote Christianism, to educate people about the message that was given. She came from a wealthy family, as interesting enough, a lot of the people we're going to see today have come from wealthy families. So she would not back down. She was so fervent in her belief because she would tell folks that she had the visions and she had the voices that would tell her all of these things, that she could not decry, she could not renege in her vision. And for that, she was taken into an arena with wild animals and other gladiators, and she was basically killed with 4 other people, other Christians, early Christians. So we see a pattern that in these early days, we see communications trying to ensure that there will be people following and listening and opening their hearts to the message of Jesus. Even in places where that belief would threaten their own lives. So people like Vibia has been recorded in our history as those who have, for whatever reason,